Private First Class Laura Jensen had joined the army with wide eyes and a stubborn determination to prove herself. The first year had been grueling long marches under punishing heat, drills that stripped away weakness, and the unspoken pressure of being one of the few women in her unit. Yet, despite it all, she had built a reputation for competence. She wasn't the fastest, the strongest, or the loudest, but she was steady, reliable, the kind of soldier who earned quiet respect. The barracks on that Friday night hummed with restless energy. Most soldiers had finished their duties and were sprawled across bunks, trading jokes, nursing cans of soda, or scribbling in notebooks. Outside, the Texas heat still pressed down like a heavy blanket, even after the sun had set. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed above, giving the room a sterile, uncomfortable glow. Colonel Richard Riggs entered without warning. Everyone knew his temper. Decorated for his service overseas, he wore his medals like armor, a reminder that he commanded not just authority, but fear. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the swagger of someone who thought rules bent for him. His drinking habits were whispered about constantly, but nobody dared confront him. That night, the smell of whiskey clung to him before he even spoke. His eyes locked onto Laura. "You," he barked, his voice rough, carrying across the room. "Jensen." She stood immediately, posture stiff, her training kicking in despite the unease crawling under her skin. "Sir?" Riggs strode closer, his steps heavy against the linoleum floor. He held a thin folder in his hand and slapped it against his thigh. "You filed this report wrong. Wrong time, wrong details. Sloppy." Laura blinked. She knew the report he meant, the supply status log for medical kits. She had double-checked it twice. "Sir, with respect, the figures were accurate." Sergeant Williams reviewed them. Her words only inflamed him. His face darkened, his jaw clenching. "Don't you correct me." The room grew still. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably on their bunks. Some looked down, pretending to be absorbed in their boots or the floor tiles, anything to avoid eye contact. Others glanced nervously between Laura and the colonel, knowing what happened when Riggs lost control. He stepped closer until the stench of alcohol hit Laura full force. "You think you know better than me?" He sneered. Laura didn't flinch. She met his gaze, though every instinct screamed at her to look away. "No, sir. I only meant the numbers were checked." That was when it happened. With startling speed for a man his size, Riggs shoved her hard toward the barracks restroom, which was just a few feet away. She stumbled but caught herself on the doorframe. Before she could react, his hand gripped the back of her neck and forced her head down. The cold porcelain rim of the toilet smashed against her cheek, and in an instant, her face was submerged in foul water. Gasps erupted around the room. No one moved. Laura's lungs screamed as she jerked upward, but Riggs's hand was iron. For a few terrifying seconds, panic clawed at her chest. The humiliation burned as sharply as the lack of air. Then, just as abruptly, he released her. She staggered back, drenched, coughing, water dripping down her uniform. The colonel's laughter rang out, ugly and hollow. "That'll teach you to challenge me," he slurred. He tossed the folder onto a nearby bunk and walked out, leaving stunned silence in his wake. For a moment, no one breathed. Laura wiped her face with trembling hands, water running down her temples and dripping onto the floor. Her heart pounded, not just from the assault, but from the weight of what it meant. She scanned the room. Every soldier's eyes darted away. Not one of them spoke. The silence hurt more than the act itself. Finally, one private, barely out of training, whispered, "Jensen, you okay?" His voice shook. Laura didn't answer right away. She inhaled deeply, forcing air into her lungs, forcing control into her voice. "I'm fine," she said flatly, though she wasn't. Not at all. She straightened, her soaked uniform clinging to her frame, her boots squelching with every step as she moved back toward her bunk. Inside, a war raged. Shame, fury, disbelief. The image of Riggs's mocking grin replayed in her mind like a brand she couldn't shake. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the barracks settled into uneasy silence. The fluorescent lights had been dimmed. The hum of snores filled the air, but sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt his hand on her neck again, pushing her down, laughing. She thought of calling her parents back home. Her father, who had worked endless shifts at the auto plant, had always told her, "You've got more fight in you than most men I know." Her mother had cried the day Lara enlisted, torn between fear and pride. Lavra couldn't tell them what happened, not yet. But she knew one thing: she would not be broken. By morning, the whispers had already begun. "Did you see what Riggs did? He won't get in trouble, he never does. Poor Jensen. She'll probably request transfer." Lavra walked into the mess hall with her head held high, though her stomach churned. Conversation stopped as she entered. Soldiers quickly looked away, pretending not to stare, but the weight of their silence pressed on her like lead. She sat down with her tray of eggs and toast, but barely touched the food. Across the hall, she caught the eye of Sergeant Williams, the one who had signed off on her report. His gaze flickered with guilt, then dropped. Cowards, she thought bitterly. After breakfast, she slipped outside, the Texas sun already blazing. She stood near the flagpole, breathing deeply, grounding herself. The Army had taught her discipline, resilience, obedience, but it had also taught her that men like Riggs thrived because others allowed them to. Not her, not this time. That night's humiliation replayed in her head, sharper now. It wasn't just an assault on her, it was an insult to every soldier who wore the uniform with honor. Riggs had crossed a line, and she couldn't let it stand. She clenched her fists. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. And she wouldn't let him define her. She was going to fight back, not with fists or screams, but with the one weapon he couldn't silence: truth. Lavra Jensen had always been stubborn. It was a trait she'd carried since childhood, when she would argue with her older brothers until they finally let her have the last word. Growing up in a small working-class town, she had learned early that survival depended on resilience. Her father worked long shifts at the auto plant. Her mother waitressed double shifts at the diner. They never had much, but they had dignity, and Lavra absorbed that like oxygen. That dignity was what the colonel had tried to strip from her when he shoved her head into the toilet. And it was the same dignity that now burned in her chest like a torch, keeping her upright even as shame and anger twisted inside her. The barracks had changed overnight. Where once there had been jokes, camaraderie, and casual chatter, now there was silence when Lavra walked in. Soldiers avoided her gaze, or worse, gave her fleeting looks of pity. It wasn't that they didn't know what had happened. Everyone knew. It was that no one wanted to get involved. Fear of Colonel Riggs was stronger than their outrage. At breakfast the next morning, Lavra pushed eggs around her tray, appetite gone. Across the mess hall, she caught sight of Sergeant Williams, the same sergeant who had co-signed her report. He looked at her, his face pale, then dropped his eyes to his food. That single glance told her everything. He knew the truth, but he would not risk his career for her. Cowards, she thought bitterly. Afterward, as soldiers dispersed to their assignments, Lavra lingered. She found herself standing at the flagpole again, staring at the American flag rippling in the Texas wind. She'd sworn an oath to protect the values it stood for: integrity, honor, justice. Yet inside this base, one man had violated those values with impunity, and everyone else was too afraid to speak. Not her. She wasn't naive. She understood the risks. Whistleblowers were rarely rewarded in the military. Many are quietly discharged, their reputations stained, their careers ruined. Still, Laura couldn't stomach the thought of doing nothing. Silence would mean he won. Silence would mean he'd do it again to someone else. That night, back in the barracks, Lavra began her quiet war. She pulled out a small notebook from her footlocker, one she usually reserved for jotting down training notes. Instead, she wrote the date, Friday, 23:17 hours. Then, in neat handwriting, she described everything. Riggs's entrance, the smell of whiskey, his accusation, her response, the assault, his laughter. She described the look on the faces of the soldiers who had witnessed it, their shock, their fear, their silence. She knew this notebook would become her weapon. Over the next week, she began carefully approaching people who had been present. She didn't confront them outright. Instead, she asked pointed questions. "You were in the barracks that night, right?" she said casually to Private Ellis while folding laundry. He froze for a moment, then nodded. "You saw what happened?" Ellis's eyes darted to the door, as if expecting Riggs to walk in at any moment. "Yeah," he admitted softly. "But don't ask me to say it out loud. I've got 2 kids." If Riggs finds out I talked, Lavra didn't press further. She simply noted his name in her book, along with his reluctant confirmation. She didn't need him to testify yet. She only needed to know he'd seen the truth. Later, she cornered Specialist Marino outside the gym. Marino was tougher, less afraid. He had been standing only a few feet away during the incident. "You saw it, right?" Lavra asked bluntly. Marino hesitated, then nodded. "Saw everything. Bastard had no right. But listen, Jensen, you go after him. You're gonna get crushed. Guys like Riggs. They've got friends in high places. Protect themselves, cover for each other. That's how it works. Not if we bring proof," Lavra said. Marino shook his head. Proof means nothing when the system's rotten. But Lavra wrote his name down anyway. Every admission mattered. She also began studying the regulations, Uniform Code of Military Justice, reporting procedures, Inspector General protocols. She pored over manuals late into the night, memorizing policies, learning exactly which loopholes commanders used to bury complaints. Knowledge, she realized, would be her shield. If she made a single procedural error, Riggs would exploit it. Meanwhile, Riggs carried on as if nothing had happened. He strutted through the base, barking orders, cracking jokes, his arrogance unshaken. To him, Lavra was already beaten. He believed humiliation had done its job, that she would shrink, keep her head down, and eventually disappear. But every insult, every dismissive glance, only fueled her resolve. One evening, she sat with her closest friend in the barracks, Specialist Rachel Kim. Rachel had seen her soaked uniform the night it happened, had watched the colonel walk out laughing. Unlike the others, Rachel hadn't turned away. "What are you planning?" Rachel asked quietly. Lavra glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. "I'm writing everything down. Building a case. I'm not letting him bury this." Rachel's eyes widened. "Lavra, that's dangerous. You go after him, you'll be the one who ends up court-martialed. They'll say you're lying, that you're unstable. You'll lose everything." Laura's voice was steady. "Then let me lose everything. Better that than let him think he can do this to anyone else." Rachel stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "You're either the bravest person I know, or the craziest. Maybe both," Lavra said with a faint smile. Days turned into weeks. Lavra kept adding to her notebook, filling it with times, dates, overheard conversations, even the subtle gestures of fear she noticed in others whenever Riggs entered the room. Slowly, the weight of her documentation grew, but so did the tension. Rumors began to swirl. Some soldiers whispered that Laura was planning something, that she was trouble. Others avoided her entirely, fearing guilt by association. A few muttered cruel remarks under their breath suggesting she had provoked the colonel, that she had asked for it. The isolation was suffocating, but Lavra held her ground. She pushed harder in training, volunteered for extra shifts, and maintained her composure. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Inside, however, she knew the storm was coming. Colonel Riggs was too arrogant to suspect she was building a case, but the military machine surrounding him was powerful. If she made her move too soon, her complaint could be buried before it ever reached daylight. She had to be precise, strategic, and most importantly patient. Late one night, sitting alone at her desk, Laura closed her notebook and stared at the ceiling. The barracks were quiet, her fellow soldiers asleep. She thought again of her father's words, "You've got more fight in you than most men I know." She clenched her fists and whispered into the darkness, "I won't let him win." The decision was final. Lavra Jensen was no longer just a private enduring orders. She was a soldier preparing for battle, the kind that wasn't fought with weapons or drills, but with truth, courage, and unrelenting determination. And though no one else believed it yet, she was going to bring a colonel down. Lavra Jensen was no stranger to pressure. Basic training had been designed to break recruits down, to push them to the edge of exhaustion until only grit kept them standing. She had survived all of that, but nothing compared to the silent war she was now waging. It wasn't fought with rifles or drills, but with notebooks, whispered conversations, and a growing determination that the colonel's reign of fear would end with her. Every day, Riggs carried himself as if nothing had happened. He barked orders during drills, scolded officers for trivial mistakes, and strutted through the mess hall with the arrogance of a man convinced he was untouchable. To most, he was. But Laura had begun quietly chipping away at that illusion. Her notebook was filling fast. Names of witnesses, dates, descriptions of conversations. Even details that might have seemed insignificant at first. The colonel's late-night whiskey habit, the way soldiers froze when he entered a room. Laura recorded everything. She knew that if her case was to survive military bureaucracy, it had to be airtight. One evening, she cornered Private Ellis again in the laundry room. The machines hummed loudly, their rumbling disguising the low tones of their voices. "You told me you saw it," Laura said carefully. Ellis avoided her eyes, folding shirts like his life depended on it. "I did. But I can't, Laura. If you put my name down anywhere, I'm done. He'll crush me. You know what he's capable of." Lavra reached into her pocket and showed him her notebook. "I'm not asking you to testify now. I just need the truth recorded. One day, when this breaks, they'll ask who saw it. I need to know who'll back me when the time comes." Ellis swallowed hard and nodded reluctantly. "Fine, write it down. But don't you dare use it unless you're ready to burn the whole house down." "I'm ready," Lavra said, her voice steady. Later that week, she managed to speak with Specialist Moreno again, this time outside the gym. Sweat glistened on his arms as he finished a run, but his expression hardened when she brought up the colonel. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" he asked. "As serious as it gets," Lavra replied. Moreno sighed, wiping his forehead with a towel. "Then you need more than witnesses. You need something physical, documents, recordings. Otherwise, it'll be your word against his. And trust me, command will back the guy with the medals." Lavra nodded. She had already been thinking the same. That night, she bought a cheap recorder online and had it shipped quietly. When it arrived, she kept it hidden deep in her locker. She didn't know when she'd get the chance to use it, but the opportunity came faster than expected. 2 weeks after the assault, Riggs confronted her again. This time in the corridor, outside the mess hall. "You still think you're some kind of smart soldier, Jensen?" He sneered, leaning close so no one else could hear. "Word of advice, keep your mouth shut. You don't want to make enemies in this army." Lavra felt her pulse quicken, but she forced her voice calm. "Are you threatening me, sir?" Riggs smirked. "Call it advice." Her hand brushed the pocket of her uniform where the recorder sat. The small red light blinked faintly, hidden from view. She had caught him. Not the assault itself, but a clear threat. It wasn't enough to convict him on its own, but it was a start of thread she could pull. That night, she wrote furiously in her notebook. Every word Riggs had said. Every detail of his expression. She could feel momentum building, even if only slightly. But danger built too. Word began to spread that Laura was stirring trouble. She noticed conversations stop when she entered rooms. A few soldiers muttered under their breath that she was going to ruin everyone's careers with her crusade. One morning, she found a note slipped under her door. "Shut up or get out." She sat on her bunk staring at it, her jaw tight. Fear pricked at her edges, but beneath it burned anger. If Riggs thought intimidation would silence her, he had underestimated her completely. Rachel Kim, her closest friend, sat beside her. "You need to be careful, Lara. This isn't just Riggs anymore. People are scared. They'll turn on you if it means protecting themselves?" Lara nodded. "Then I'll stand alone if I have to." Rachel shook her head. "You're not alone. Not really. You've got me. And maybe more people than you realize. They're just waiting to see if you survive the first hit." The words stuck with Lavra. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe her courage could be contagious, but only if she kept going. Over the next month, Laura's notebook became her lifeline. She recorded every small piece of evidence she could gather: guard duty logs, the colonel's schedule, even subtle changes in his behavior. Riggs seemed more paranoid lately, glancing over his shoulder as though he sensed something was building. The base itself felt like a pressure cooker. Some soldiers whispered their quiet support, telling Laura in hushed voices that they believed her, that they hated Riggs too. Others kept their distance entirely, terrified of being dragged into the fight. But Lavra could feel the tide shifting, inch by inch. One night, sitting alone in the barracks, she read through her notes and recordings. It wasn't enough yet. She needed more, something undeniable. She knew the Inspector General's office would not move on half-formed allegations. They needed a case too strong to bury. She leaned back on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. The fan above spun lazily, clicking with each rotation. She thought of her parents again, her father's quiet strength, her mother's pride. They had taught her never to let bullies win. She whispered to herself, "Not this time." Not him. Lavra Jensen was ready for the next step. The colonel didn't know it yet, but the walls around him were beginning to crack. The weight of Lavra Jensen's notebook grew heavier with every passing day. Not physically, it was a small, battered thing, its spine bent, its pages filled with neat handwriting, but in meaning. Inside were names, dates, times, and the whispered truths of soldiers too afraid to speak aloud. Inside was the blueprint of a case strong enough to shatter a colonel's career. Yet even with her growing collection of evidence, Lavra understood the stakes. The military was notorious for swallowing complaints. Reports vanished. Whistleblowers were branded as liars or unstable. Careers were ruined, not those of the guilty, but of those brave enough to speak. Still, Lavra had reached a point of no return. The confrontation outside the mess hall, where Riggs had threatened her in hushed tones, had been the final spark. She replayed his smirk over and over in her mind, the way he thought intimidation alone could erase what he had done. That recording in her pocket was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme, but to Laura it was proof that he wasn't untouchable. She couldn't keep waiting. She had to act. One evening, after another long day of drills, Lavra slipped away to the base's administrative wing. The halls were quiet, most offices dark. She had memorized the procedure from the regulations she studied at night. Complaints of misconduct could be filed directly to the Inspector General's office. It was risky. Bypassing the chain of command was itself a gamble, but she had no choice. Riggs was her chain of command. Going through him meant certain death for her case. She carried a thick folder tucked under her arm. Inside were copies of her notes, statements she had convinced Marino and Ellis to sign reluctantly, and a transcript of the recording where Riggs had threatened her. Her palms were sweating when she knocked on the office door. Captain Harris, the duty officer, looked up from his desk. He was younger than she expected, maybe mid-30s, his uniform crisp, his expression curious. "Jensen, what brings you here this late?" Laura drew a steady breath. "Sir, I'd like to file a formal complaint with the Inspector General." The captain's brows furrowed. He leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Do you understand what that means?" "Yes, sir," Lavra said firmly. "I understand." Harris motioned for her to sit. "All right. Let's see what you've got." For the next hour, Lavra laid everything out. The assault, the witnesses, the intimidation. She handed him the folder, her hands trembling only slightly. Harris flipped through the pages, his eyes sharpening the deeper he went. When he reached the transcript of Riggs's threat, he read it twice. When she finished, silence filled the room. Harris finally set the folder down and folded his hands together. "This is serious," he said quietly. "Yes, sir. You know the kind of blowback this could bring." "I know," Lavra said. Her voice didn't waver. "But it has to stop." Harris nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. "All right, Jensen. I'll forward this. The Inspector General's office will review it. You'll need to be prepared to testify." "I'm prepared," she said. Walking back to the barracks that night, Lavra felt a strange mix of fear and relief. She had taken the step she couldn't undo. The machinery of justice, slow, grinding, unpredictable, was now in motion. For a few days, nothing happened. Riggs strutted about as usual, his laughter echoing down the hallways, his swagger unbroken. Lavra carried herself as if nothing had changed, though inside her chest was a storm. She waited, counting the hours, second-guessing whether Harris had really filed her report, whether it would disappear into a drawer like so many others. Then it happened. It was mid-morning when military police entered the administrative building. The entire base seemed to pause, soldiers slowing in their tracks as the MPs, stone-faced, marched toward Colonel Riggs's office. Word spread like wildfire. Something was happening. Lavra stood at attention outside the training grounds, sweat dripping from her forehead when she saw them escorting Riggs out in handcuffs. The colonel's face was crimson with rage, his mouth spitting curses at anyone within earshot. "This is a mistake. You can't do this to me." The sight was surreal. For years, Riggs had ruled the base with intimidation. Now, in a single moment, he was reduced to a prisoner being led away by soldiers who didn't flinch at his threats. Around Lara, whispers erupted. "Holy hell! Is this real? Riggs is done?" She kept her face neutral, her training holding her steady, but inside, adrenaline surged. She hadn't expected it to happen so fast. She hadn't expected to see the mighty colonel fall in such a public, humiliating way. That night, the barracks buzzed like never before. Soldiers who had once avoided her now stole glances, their expressions filled with shock, curiosity, even respect. Some whispered quietly that she must have been the one behind it. Others stayed silent, too afraid to admit what they suspected. Rachel Kim approached her as she sat polishing her boots. "That was you, wasn't it?" she whispered. Laura didn't answer. She didn't need to. Rachel gave a slow smile. You just changed everything. But Lavra knew the fight wasn't over. Riggs might be in custody, but the trial was still to come. The investigation would dig deep, and she would be under scrutiny as much as he was. There would be people who doubted her, people who wanted her gone, people who would call her a liar. Still, as she stared at her reflection in the shine of her boots, she felt stronger than she had in weeks. For the first time since that humiliating night, she believed justice might actually be possible. The arrest of Colonel Riggs shook the base like an earthquake. Soldiers who once marched under his barked orders now whispered in clusters, trying to make sense of what they had seen. For years, Riggs had seemed invincible, a man with too many medals, too many connections, and too much arrogance to ever be touched. Yet the sight of him in handcuffs, red-faced and spitting curses, was burned into everyone's memory. For Lavra Jensen, the days that followed felt both liberating and suffocating. She no longer had to see Riggs swagger through the mess hall, no longer had to endure his veiled threats. But in his absence, the base was divided. Some soldiers quietly congratulated her, slipping brief words of encouragement when no one else could hear. Good job, Jensen. You did the right thing. Their eyes carried gratitude, as though her courage had lifted a weight they hadn't realized they carried. Others weren't so kind. Rumors spread like wildfire, claims that Lavra had fabricated her story, that she had exaggerated, that she was seeking attention. One morning, she overheard a group of sergeants muttering at a table in the mess hall. This is what happens when you let soft recruits in, one said. She couldn't hack it, so she took down a good officer. Lavra kept her head down, her jaw tight. She wanted to scream at them, to demand if they thought shoving her head in a toilet was leadership. But she didn't. She couldn't. Every move she made now would be scrutinized, twisted against her if she wasn't careful. The investigation had begun. She was called into a series of interviews, each one more exhausting than the last. Military lawyers in stiff uniforms asked her to recount the assault in painstaking detail, what time it happened, who was nearby, how long it lasted. They questioned her about her notes, her recordings, the statements she had gathered. Some questions cut deeper than she expected. Why didn't you report it immediately? Did you provoke him in any way? Lavra kept her voice steady, but each question felt like a blade. She knew they weren't designed to hurt her, but to test her story's strength. Still, the implication that she had somehow brought this on herself stung. After one particularly grueling session, she collapsed on her bunk, staring at the ceiling until Rachel slid into the room. You okay? Rachel asked softly. Lavra nodded, though her eyes burned. They make you feel like you're the one on trial. Rachel sighed. That's how it always works. But you're tougher than they think. You've got this. What neither of them expected was what came next. 2 weeks into the investigation, another soldier came forward. Private Lewis, a quiet young man barely out of high school, walked into the Inspector General's office with trembling hands and a story of his own. Riggs had once cornered him in a supply closet, berating him until he broke down in tears, then threatening to ruin his career if he told anyone. Then came Sergeant O'Malley, who admitted that Riggs had physically shoved him during a training exercise years earlier. And Specialist Moreno, emboldened by Laura's actions, finally spoke publicly about the night he had seen Riggs assault her. Suddenly, Laura wasn't alone. The picture was no longer one woman's accusation. It was a pattern, a trail of intimidation and abuse stretching back years. Word of these testimonies spread quickly. For many, it confirmed what they had long suspected, but were too afraid to say aloud. Riggs had been a tyrant, and Lavra had simply been the first to stand up. But the backlash intensified too. Some soldiers resented the chaos. They muttered that the unit's cohesion was unraveling, that morale was suffering. A few openly blamed Lavra for it. One evening, as she left the mess hall, she found the word traitor scrawled on her locker in permanent marker. Her stomach dropped, but she didn't erase it. Instead, she left it there, a silent reminder of what she was fighting against. The investigation stretched on. Each day brought new interviews, new documents, new witnesses. Laura's name became synonymous with the case, whether spoken with admiration or disdain. And through it all, she kept going. She ran drills in the morning with the same determination as always. She studied manuals at night, her discipline unbroken. If anyone thought she would crumble, she made sure to prove them wrong. But inside, the strain was real. Some nights she lay awake, heart racing, wondering if she had made a mistake. What if Riggs somehow walked free? What if the system failed, as it often did? What if all she had done was paint a target on her back? On those nights, Rachel was her anchor. "You've already won more than you think," she would whisper. "People are speaking out because of you. You've broken his grip. Even if the system tries to protect him, it'll never be the same again." Lavra clung to those words. One afternoon, Captain Harris called her into his office. His expression was unreadable as he handed her a thick folder. "The investigation is moving to Article 32 proceedings," he said. "That means a preliminary hearing before the court-martial. They'll determine if there's enough evidence to proceed with a full trial." Lavra flipped through the folder, her throat tightening at the list of names inside. Witnesses. Dozens of them now. Not just Lewis, O'Malley, and Moreno, but others who had finally found their voices. Harris leaned forward. "You need to know, Riggs has hired aggressive counsel. They'll attack your credibility. They'll dig into your past, your training records, your personal life. Be ready." Lavra met his gaze. "I am." Leaving the office, she felt a strange calm settle over her. For months, she had been fighting in the shadows, carrying secrets in her notebook, wondering if anyone would believe her. Now, it was no longer just her word. It was a chorus of voices, a wave too big to be ignored. The bass still buzzed with division, but there was a shift in the air. For every sneer she endured, there was a soldier who nodded quietly at her in passing, their eyes saying what their lips couldn't. "Thank you." Lavra knew the hardest part was yet to come, the courtroom, the cross-examinations, the public scrutiny. But she also knew something else. For the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. The Article 32 hearing began on a gray Monday morning. Clouds hung low over the base, casting long shadows across the parade grounds, as if even the weather sensed the gravity of the day. For Lavra Jensen, the weight in her chest was heavier than her rucksack had ever been. She had faced brutal drills, live fire exercises, and nights of bone-deep exhaustion, but nothing compared to the knowledge that she was about to sit in a room where her very character would be dissected. The courtroom was a stark military space rows of wooden benches, the American flag hanging prominently, and the sharp scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. Officers filled the seats, their uniforms pressed, their eyes sharp. On one side of the room sat Colonel Riggs, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched. His lawyer, a seasoned civilian in an expensive suit, whispered into his ear with a confidence that made Laura's stomach twist. On the other side sat the prosecution, a major with a calm, precise manner. Lavra had met him twice before. He had assured her that the evidence was strong, that the witnesses would hold. Still, as she sat at the witness table, she felt exposed. The proceedings began with formality, the reading of charges. Assault, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming of an officer. Each word echoed in the room like a hammer strike. Riggs didn't flinch. When it was Laura's turn to testify, she rose, her boots clicking against the floor. She swore her oath and took her seat, facing the panel of officers who would decide whether Riggs would face a full court-martial. The prosecution began gently. The major guided her through the events of that night, her assignment, her confrontation with Riggs, the assault itself. Laura's voice trembled at first, but she steadied it, recounting each detail with precision. She described the sound of water rushing in the latrine, the humiliation of being shoved, the sharp burn of fear when Riggs threatened her afterward. When she finished, the room was silent. The major nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Then the defense attorney rose. His movements were smooth, deliberate, like a predator circling prey. He adjusted his tie before addressing her. "Specialist Jensen," he began, his tone almost polite. "You've painted a vivid picture, but I'd like to clarify a few things. You claim this incident happened late at night. Can you explain why you didn't immediately report it?" Laura gripped the edge of the table. "Because Colonel Riggs was my commanding officer. I feared retaliation. I needed time to gather my courage." The attorney smiled thinly. "Or perhaps you needed time to create a story." "No, sir," Laura said firmly. "I needed time to survive." Murmurs rippled through the room. The lawyer pressed on. "You allege physical assault. Yet there are no medical records, no photographs, no physical evidence. Isn't it true that this is simply your word against a decorated colonel's?" Lavra met his gaze, her spine straight. "It's my word, and the words of those who witnessed his behavior. And I kept records, notes, dates, times, because I knew one day this would come." The lawyer's expression flickered, just slightly. But he wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his voice lowering. "You're a young soldier, specialist. Isn't it true you've struggled in training? That you've been reprimanded for insubordination?" Laura's jaw tightened. "Like every soldier, I've had challenges. But none of that excuses what happened." The lawyer smirked, as if satisfied he had planted doubt. He turned to the panel. "This is the picture we're asked to believe, that a colonel with decades of service suddenly decided to assault a subordinate in a latrine, with no one else present, and no evidence. Does that make sense?" Before Laura could respond, the prosecution interjected. "Objection. The defense is testifying." "Sustained," the presiding officer said. Lavra exhaled slowly. The exchange had left her shaken, but she refused to show it. She glanced at the benches where Rachel Kim sat, her eyes locked on Lavra with silent encouragement. Then came the witnesses. Private Ellis took the stand, his hands trembling as he recounted what he had seen, the colonel cornering Laura, the aggression in his posture, her soaked uniform afterward. He admitted he had been too afraid to intervene, but his voice cracked with guilt as he said, "I saw enough to know she's telling the truth." Next was Specialist Marino, who confirmed the colonel's long history of intimidation. Then Sergeant O'Malley. Then Private Lewis. One by one, their voices layered onto Laura's, painting a damning portrait of Riggs's abuse of power. The defense attacked each of them, trying to poke holes, suggesting exaggeration, claiming bias. But the sheer number of witnesses made the strategy falter. The panel listened, their expressions growing more serious with each testimony. Finally, Riggs himself was called. He stood tall, his chest puffed out, his voice booming with the confidence of a man used to command. "These accusations are lies," he declared. "Fabrications by weak soldiers who couldn't handle discipline. This is nothing but an attempt to destroy my career." The defense lawyer guided him through a series of rehearsed denials. Riggs claimed he had never even been in the latrine that night, that Lavra had invented the story because she resented his strict leadership. He scoffed at the idea he would ever lower himself to such behavior. But under cross-examination, cracks appeared. The prosecutor asked calmly, "Colonel, do you recall threatening Specialist Jensen outside the mess hall?" Riggs hesitated, then sneered. "I don't recall." Soldiers exaggerate. The prosecutor lifted a transcript. We have an audio recording. Would you like the panel to hear it? Riggs's jaw tightened. Taken out of context, but the damage was done. The panel members exchanged glances. The man who had seemed untouchable now appeared cornered. After hours of testimony, the hearing adjourned. Lavra sat outside the courtroom, her hands shaking as the panel deliberated. She felt hollow, drained, every nerve in her body stretched thin. Rachel sat beside her, squeezing her hand. "You were incredible," she whispered. Lavra shook her head. "They tore me apart, but you didn't break," Rachel said. "That's what matters." When the panel finally returned, the presiding officer's voice was solemn. "The evidence presented is sufficient to proceed to a full court-martial. Colonel Riggs will stand trial." The words washed over Laura like a wave. Relief, fear, exhaustion all colliding at once. The fight wasn't over, but they had crossed a critical threshold. Riggs would face justice, not behind closed doors, but in a courtroom where the truth would be laid bare. As the courtroom emptied, Riggs was led out under guard. For the first time, he didn't look at Lavra with arrogance. His eyes were cold, calculating, but there was something else to a flicker of fear. Lavra stood taller, her shoulders squared. She had survived the first battle. The war for justice was only beginning, but for the first time, she truly believed she could win. The court-martial of Colonel Douglas Riggs began 6 weeks after the Article 32 hearing. By then, the entire base buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't just another proceeding, it was a spectacle. A colonel, a man once untouchable, now stood trial before his peers. Soldiers whispered about it in the mess hall, in formation, in the gym. Everyone knew it wasn't only Riggs on trial. It was the system itself, and whether it would protect the powerful or defend the truth. Lavra Jensen felt the weight of that expectation every time she put on her uniform. She walked into the military courthouse with her chin high, but inside, her stomach twisted. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the privates, the specialists, the sergeants who had come forward. It was about every soldier who had swallowed abuse in silence, convinced no one would ever listen. The courtroom was larger than the one at the hearing. Rows of officers filled the benches, their ribbons gleaming, their notebooks open. A panel of senior officers sat in judgment, their faces grave. The prosecution team was ready, their stacks of files lined neatly. Across the room sat Riggs, his uniform immaculate, his expression a mask of calm. But his eyes sharp, restless, betrayed a flicker of desperation. The charges were read again. Assault, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming of an officer, multiple counts of intimidation. Each word echoed like a drumbeat. The prosecution began with a methodical presentation. They laid out the timeline, the witnesses, the notes Lavra had kept. They played the audio recording of Riggs's threat. The sound of his voice filled the room, sneering and venomous, and Lavra watched as the panel members' faces hardened. Then came the witnesses. Private Ellis, voice shaking but steady. Sergeant O'Malley, fists clenched as he described being shoved during training. Private Lewis, stammering as he told of being cornered and humiliated. Specialist Marino, finally speaking openly about what he had seen that night. Each testimony added weight, each story layering over the last. The picture was no longer of a single incident, but of a pattern, a reign of intimidation that stretched back years. When Laura's turn came, she walked to the stand with her shoulders square. She swore her oath and sat down, the panel's eyes fixed on her. The prosecutor guided her carefully. She told her story again, this time in front of the entire room. The humiliation, the fear, the decision to gather evidence instead of rushing forward blindly. Her voice trembled only once, when she described the moment Riggs's hand forced her head down, but she steadied it quickly. She would not let him see her break. When the defense attorney rose, the air in the room shifted. He was relentless, circling her testimony like a wolf. Specialist Jensen, isn't it true you waited weeks before filing a complaint? Yes, Lavra said evenly. Because I knew the risk of retaliation. I needed evidence, and I gathered it. He pressed harder. Or perhaps you needed time to invent a convincing story. No, sir, Lavra replied firmly. I needed time to make sure the truth couldn't be buried. The lawyer flipped through a file. You've had disciplinary marks in your record, haven't you? Struggled in training? Doesn't that show you have a grudge against strict leadership? Lavra held his gaze. Struggling in training doesn't mean I lie about assault. It means I'm human. And I'm still here. The lawyer's lips tightened. He shifted tactics. You expect this court to believe that a decorated colonel, with decades of honorable service, risked everything by committing an assault in a latrine? Alone? No evidence? No witnesses? Laura's voice was steady. Not alone. He counted on silence. He counted on fear. That's how he operated for years. The courtroom fell quiet at her words. The defense called Riggs to testify. He stood tall, his voice booming with self-righteousness. I have served this country with honor for 30 years. These accusations are lies, concocted by weak soldiers who couldn't handle discipline. Jensen is disgruntled, seeking attention, and the rest are piling on to save their own skins. He went on for nearly an hour, dismissing every charge, portraying himself as a victim of a conspiracy. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably, but his voice carried the weight of someone who had commanded for decades. Then came the cross-examination. The prosecutor's voice was calm. Colonel Riggs, you deny threatening Specialist Jensen? I do. Yet this recording clearly captures your voice saying, keep your mouth shut or you'll regret it. Do you deny this is your voice? Riggs's jaw tightened. It was taken out of context. The prosecutor leaned closer. What context makes that appropriate for a commanding officer to say to a subordinate? Silence. Riggs's face reddened. The prosecutor pressed on. Colonel, do you deny that multiple soldiers have testified to your pattern of intimidation, your physical aggression, your abuse of power? Riggs snapped, his voice rising. They're liars. Every single one of them. Weak, insubordinate liars. The courtroom went still. The panel members' expressions hardened further. In that moment, Riggs no longer looked like a decorated officer. He looked like a man unmasked. When testimony ended, both sides delivered closing arguments. The prosecution spoke of courage, of soldiers who had risked their careers to speak the truth, of a culture that demanded accountability. The defense painted Lavra as manipulative, Riggs as a victim of mutiny. Then the panel withdrew to deliberate. Hours dragged by like days. Lavra sat outside the courtroom, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. Rachel sat beside her, whispering reassurances, but Laura's mind spun with every possible outcome. Finally, the doors opened. The panel filed back in, their faces unreadable. The presiding officer stood, his voice steady. On the charges of assault, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming of an officer Colonel Douglas Riggs is found guilty. The words crashed over the room like thunder. A gasp rippled through the benches. Riggs's face turned pale, his jaw slack, his bravado evaporating. Lavra sat frozen, her heart pounding. Guilty. The word echoed in her skull, almost too big to comprehend. The presiding officer continued. Colonel Riggs is hereby dismissed from the United States Army with dishonor and sentenced to confinement. The courtroom erupted in whispers. MPs stepped forward, placing Riggs in custody. He struggled, shouting curses, his once commanding voice reduced to a desperate roar. This isn't over. You'll regret this. But no one listened. Lavra sat in silence, tears stinging her eyes. Not tears of weakness, but of release. The fight that had consumed her life for months had ended. The colonel who once shoved her head into a toilet had been stripped of his power, exposed for what he was. Rachel squeezed her shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. Lavra exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. "We did it." For the first time in months, she felt light. The system hadn't been perfect. It had been slow, painful, brutal. But in the end, the truth had been louder than fear. And Lavra Jensen, the young specialist who refused to stay silent, had changed everything. The courtroom was emptying, but Laura Jensen remained seated for a moment, letting the gravity of the verdict wash over her. Colonel Douglas Riggs, once untouchable, had been found guilty on all charges. He had been stripped of rank, honor, and authority. Soldiers whispered among themselves, processing what had just occurred. The base itself felt different, as though the walls had absorbed years of fear and now exhaled relief. Laura's mind raced back through the months that had led to this moment. The humiliation of that first night, the silence of witnesses, the exhaustion of meticulously documenting everything. Every late night, every whispered conversation, every calculated risk had led here. Justice, fragile and uncertain, had finally been realized. As she walked through the corridors, she noticed subtle changes. Soldiers who had avoided her now offered quiet nods or smiles. Privates who had once been afraid to speak up now approached her with small words of gratitude. "Thank you," they said, almost in passing. "You gave us courage." Rachel Kim met her outside the barracks, her face alight with pride. "You did more than just survive, Laura. You inspired people. You changed this place." Lavra smiled faintly. "We changed it. I just started the fight." Word spread beyond the base. Higher-ranking officers acknowledged the case, praising the bravery of those who had come forward. Lavra received commendations, not just for her courage, but for the meticulousness and integrity she had displayed throughout the investigation. It wasn't the medals or ribbons that mattered most to her, but the recognition that the system, when pushed, could work. Yet the process had left scars. The months of tension, the whispers of doubt, the personal attacks, they lingered. Lavra spent long evenings in the barracks, reflecting on what had happened, aware that her own sense of safety had been permanently altered. She had stared fear in the face and survived, but it was impossible to ignore the vulnerability she had endured. Still, there was triumph, and it was palpable. The base held a quiet ceremony weeks later to acknowledge the trial's conclusion. It wasn't a parade, not in the traditional sense, but a gathering where soldiers and officers could process the aftermath together. Lavra watched as officers who had remained silent finally stepped forward to commend the courage of those who had testified. For many, it was an awkward, tentative acknowledgement, but it was progress. In private, she met with some of the younger soldiers who had witnessed Riggs's actions, but had hesitated to speak. She encouraged them, sharing the small victories of the trial and stressing the importance of accountability. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," she told them. "It's doing the right thing even when you're terrified." Over the following months, the base began to shift. Training sessions included discussions about professional conduct and reporting misconduct. Soldiers who had once swallowed abuse in silence now spoke up when they witnessed inappropriate behavior. The culture of fear, while not erased, had been challenged. Lavra had started a ripple effect that was already changing lives. For herself, life returned to routine, but a new routine, one tempered by experience. She trained harder, not to prove herself to others, but to honor the strength she had discovered within herself. She sought opportunities to mentor younger soldiers, teaching them not just technical skills, but the importance of integrity and courage. There were moments of quiet reflection, too. On late nights, she would walk to the flagpole, the same one she had stared at on the night of her humiliation. The flag still rippled in the Texas wind, a symbol of something larger than herself. She would trace its folds with her eyes and remember the promise she had made to never let fear dictate her actions. The psychological weight of what she had endured sometimes returned in fleeting memories. The image of her head in the toilet, Riggs's sneer, the isolation she had felt. But each memory was tempered by triumph. She had confronted it all, had kept meticulous records, had rallied witnesses, and had persisted when no one else would. In facing the darkness, she had found resilience she hadn't known existed. One afternoon, months after the verdict, Lavra received a quiet visit from Captain Harris, the officer who had first guided her to file the complaint. He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a letter from the Inspector General's office, commending her for her exemplary courage, professionalism, and dedication to justice. Laura read it slowly, her eyes misting. The words affirmed not just her actions, but the principles she had fought for, that truth and courage could triumph, even in the face of powerful opposition. Returning to her barracks, she passed by the lockers and noticed the word traitor had been painted over. A small act, but symbolic. The base was healing. It was moving forward, and she had been a catalyst for that change. The young soldiers she now mentored often asked about her experience, about what it had been like to face Riggs and the system itself. She answered honestly, emphasizing preparation, resilience, and the courage to persist despite fear. "You can't control what others do," she told them. "But you can control your actions, and sometimes that's enough to change everything." In the months that followed, Lavra continued her service with renewed purpose. She applied for leadership positions, confident in her abilities and in her ethical compass. She sought ways to prevent others from enduring what she had, initiating workshops on reporting misconduct, fostering accountability, and creating safe avenues for complaints. Her story spread beyond the base, quietly becoming a case study in military leadership programs. Officers cited it as an example of how courage, preparation, and meticulous attention to detail could confront even the most entrenched abuses of power. It was a story that resonated, one that underscored the importance of personal integrity in the military. As she stood at the flagpole one evening, the sun setting behind her, Lavra reflected on the journey she had endured. The humiliation, the fear, the months of tension, they had forged something new. Strength, resilience, and an unwavering sense of justice. She had been broken in one moment, but had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, through determination and courage. The base was not perfect. The shadows of fear and misconduct still lingered. But Lavra Jensen had proved something profound. One voice, determined and persistent, could ignite change. And in the wake of her bravery, a culture that had tolerated silence was learning to speak. She smiled faintly, letting the wind whip through her hair. The flag rippled above her, unwavering. She had kept her promise to herself and to those who had been silenced. The war was over. The battle for justice had been won. And a legacy of courage would continue long after she moved on.